Part 1, we're going to be looking at the OODA Loop, managing complexity. The OODA Loop is a framework developed by Colonel John Boyd. The OODA is O.O.D.A. The 4 components are observe, orient, decide, and act. So let's look at the first module, an overview of OODA. Colonel John Boyd was the greatest military strategist of the 20th century. For those who have studied his theories, Boyd is tossed around in the same sentences as Sun Tzu and Karl von Clausewitz. He served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam as a U.S. Air Force officer, and his ideas had a tremendous amount of impact on the Gulf War in 1991. In the late 1950s, Boyd was the best fighter pilot in America and possibly the world. He was nicknamed 42nd Boyd because he could defeat any opponent in simulated air-to-air combat in less than 40 seconds. He was more than just a great stick and rudder man, though. He was a strategist. He had developed energy maneuverability theory, called EM theory, during his spare time in the 1960s. EM theory would revolutionize the way air-to-air combat was taught and is today taught as the basic model that fighter pilots use around the world. In the early 1970s, Boyd was considered the spiritual leader of the military reform movement. This was a guerrilla movement within the military which sought to reform the culture of careerism and waste in the armed forces. General Charles C. Krulak said in the aftermath of the Gulf War that, quote, "The Iraqi army collapsed morally and intellectually under the onslaught of American and coalition forces. John Boyd was an architect of that victory, as surely as if he'd commanded a fighter wing or a maneuver division in the desert." His theories, his way of thinking about warfare and how strategy worked, was essential. In the late 70s, Boyd retired from the Air Force and went into self-imposed exile, studying philosophy, science, military history, psychology, and a dozen other seemingly unrelated fields. Moving from warrior to intellectual, he was trying to synthesize what he learned from all these domains to answer a single question. How do individuals and organizations win in an uncertain environment? The thread that tied Boyd's research together was a belief that the key to success in the uncertain modern world was not a specific belief, but the ability to rapidly change beliefs based on a rapid changing and uncertain environment. Boyd's work did what few works ever do. It changed the world. However, much of what Boyd did was either highly classified or not written down. Because the military is an oral culture, he left very few published papers, making him difficult for academics to study. Yet, over the last 2 decades, students of his work in the military have gradually moved wider into businesses, sports, science, and dozens of other fields. Their ideas challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about how to win. The ultimate result of this synthesis was the OODA Loop. So what is the OODA Loop? Boyd created the OODA Loop as a way to try to synthesize his 4 decades of research and thinking into a single diagram that answered this question. The OODA Loop is an acronym that stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. It is a description of a process that you're already doing every minute of every day. Let's say it's Saturday morning around 10 a.m. You wake up. You observe that you are hungry. You orient by remembering that there's a Chick-fil-A down the street and it's before 11 a.m., which means they are still serving chicken biscuits. You decide to go to Chick-fil-A. You act by getting in your car, going to Chick-fil-A, and eating a delicious chicken biscuit. Or maybe 2, why not? You're already there. The OODA Loop is often seen as a decision-making model, but can be more accurately described as a model of individual and organizational learning and adaptation. So let's look at an example of OODA that incorporates some of Boyd's thinking about how to use the OODA Loop effectively, applied to a real-world business situation. So this is from a more robust or more complex example of the OODA Loop. The observation phase, in this case, is data gathering in the broadest sense of the term. You're not just looking at business KPIs on a screen, you're looking at the emotional context, you're looking at industry trends, you're looking at your competitors' decisions and movements. So let's imagine you're a perceptive financial trader that understood the OODA Loop in the run-up to the 2008 financial collapse. In the observation phase, you saw that the market was on its way toward record highs. You felt the mental dimension. Many people felt the market could only go up. However, you saw there was a huge increase in financial instruments, including mortgage-backed derivatives. You saw that many of the people who were taking out mortgages had much lower incomes than people taking out mortgages 5 years earlier. This might seem like bad news, but as a general rule, bad news is the best kind of news because as long as you catch it in time, you can turn it to your advantage. So continuing with our financial trader example, you oriented and suspected there was no way all these people were going to pay off their mortgages. Many of them were lower income individuals with unsteady jobs. You saw that everyone, from homeowners with multiple mortgages to large banks, were betting on the market going up indefinitely. You hypothesized that this was irrational exuberance, and no market goes up forever. You thought once some people started to default, many others would as well, and the market would crash. You discovered a mismatch. The widespread belief was, people don't default on their mortgages. That was what everyone thought. But your orientation based on the information you gathered during your observation phase suggested otherwise. The 2008 financial collapse was bad for everyone except the people that saw the mismatches between other people's belief systems and reality. The goal you should be striving for in the orientation phase is to prove your previous beliefs wrong by finding mismatches. The sooner you can identify a mismatch, the sooner you can reorient to take advantage of it. The trader, in this case, saw a mismatch, shorted the market, and made money. The decision stage is the transition into the final stage of acting. For groups or organizations, the decision stage may require a series of meetings or discussions to adjust the strategy and roadmap based on the new orientation. Coming back to our trader in 2008 example, you might have to have a meeting with your team explaining your reasoning in the orientation phase and come to a decision about exactly how to bet against the housing market. Should you short, that is, bet against the mortgage derivatives themselves or the banks holding them? And should you do it now or should you wait a month? For an individual, the decision stage is usually unnecessary. You don't need to call a board meeting to go to Chick-fil-A. You just get in the car. Most decision-making can and should be implicit. Acting is carrying out the decision. In the trading example, you click the button or make the phone call to bet against the housing market. Then the OODA loop starts all over again. Your action to bet against the housing market will have popped up on other traders' screens. That may or may not change their actions. In either case, you'll observe what happens, orient based on the new information, and go through another OODA loop. Understanding the model a bit more, we can put together a diagram which is a little more accurate than just a loop that we initially looked at. We observe the outside world and the result of our previous actions. We take time to orient, analyzing and synthesizing everything we learned in the observation phases, taking into account cultural traditions, analysis and synthesis of previous actions and information, new information, and our genetic heritage. The orientation phase guides our decisions and actions. The result of those actions becomes more information that begins the next cycle of observation. Everyone's brain already works this way. However, the truth is that most people go through this process poorly. There were tens of thousands of people in the run-up to the 2008 financial collapse, perhaps more, that had access to this information but didn't bet against the housing market. To make decisions in an uncertain world and be correct is very, very difficult. My major conclusion from studying the OODA loop is this. Learning to live with ambiguity and uncertainty is a necessary precondition for more opportunity. If you want to quote-unquote win, you need a pretty significant amount of ambiguity and uncertainty in your life or the life of your organization or wherever it is you're looking to apply the OODA loop. The startup world, for example, is characterized by uncertainty and provides plenty of examples of what embracing ambiguity can lead to. WhatsApp, a company founded in 2009, was bought by Facebook just 6 years later at a valuation of $19 billion. Similar startup stories like Instagram, which was purchased for $1 billion less than 2 years after being founded with only a handful of employees, sort of showcase this idea of how learning to embrace ambiguity and uncertainty can create a tremendous amount of opportunity. Within companies, it's the individuals that are most adaptable, quick, and dynamic that is the best at using the OODA Loop, that are able to add the most value and advance their careers. If individuals and organizations want to survive and thrive in a highly dynamic environment, they have to embrace uncertainty and novelty and learn to use it to their advantage. Now that we have a basic understanding of what the OODA Loop is, let's have a look at what it takes to OODA well. The OODA Loop is based heavily on the scientific method. You may have noticed that it's very similar to the scientific process of observe, hypothesize, and test. You can roughly map these to the OODA Loop of observations in the scientific method are observing, hypothesis is orienting and deciding, and testing is acting. However, Boyd felt that the observation, hypothesis, test of the scientific method really missed out on the orientation stage, which was actually the most important stage in his mind. It happened informally, but it deserved to get a lot more attention, which is why he created the OODA Loop. The orientation phase is where creativity and innovation happens. Highly creative and innovative people are looking at the same reality as everyone else, but they orient in a different way than most people. Orientation shapes the way we observe, the way we decide, and the way we act. In our 2008 global financial crisis example, the information used by the traders who bet against the market and made fortunes was not secret proprietary information. Everyone in the industry had access to the mortgage contracts and the data about how many loans were being made to people with lower incomes. They were all more or less equal coming out of the observation stage. However, most people failed to orient well. Instead of looking for mismatches, they looked for ways to confirm what they already believed. This is called confirmation bias, and it's a well-researched cognitive bias that we tend to look for and filter information which confirms our pre-existing beliefs instead of looking for mismatches or ways to disprove what we believe. Orientation is the most important part of the OODA process. It's why Boyd created this and separated it from the more traditional scientific method. When we orient, it shapes our decisions and actions for the rest of our current OODA loop, which then shapes future OODA loops. This orientation compounds over time. Doing it well compounds positively and can make you increasingly effective or your organization increasingly effective, and doing it poorly compounds negatively. So, how do you orient properly? Snowmobiling is the term Boyd used for orientation done right. It requires taking all the data you've gathered in the observation phase, breaking it down deductively into its constituent parts, and then recombining those parts through creative synthesis to form a new model of reality that lets you make better decisions and actions. The people that had all the information on the mortgage market in 2006 and still lost money failed to take apart their existing beliefs about how the mortgage market worked and see the data through a different lens. One group saw unending market growth, and the other group saw a bubble waiting to pop. Another important consideration with orientation is to think in terms of the moral, mental, and physical dimensions. Boyd saw that American military generals were purely focused on the physical dimension. Everything came down to the attrition measure of body count. He who has the most soldiers is winning. They ignored the moral and mental dimensions, the winning of hearts and minds, which Boyd understood were supremely important. The Vietnam-American War had been a big lesson in this way. It had showed that a huge physical advantage, the United States' enormous military advantage over the Vietnamese, could be overcome by winning the mental and moral dimensions. The North Vietnamese were able to win the hearts, the moral component, and the minds, the mental component, by portraying themselves as nationalist freedom fighters against imperial oppressors. It's very hard to overstate just how important this was. The U.S. was the most powerful fighting force that the world had ever seen at that time. They spent $738 billion executing the Vietnam War and could not overcome the moral and mental advantages seized by the North Vietnamese. This is just as true in business. While the hard numbers certainly matter, they are only a piece of the complete picture. Experienced business people always hammer on culture because they understand how important it is. When Peter Thiel founder of PayPal and Palantir, invested $150 million in Airbnb, his biggest piece of advice to the founders was, don't mess up the culture. He understood that culture, winning the mental and moral dimensions within the company, could overcome huge external disadvantages. Like all startups, Airbnb was competing against huge incumbent companies with tremendous physical advantages. In 2014, the year Thiel invested, Airbnb had an estimated revenue of $436 million. The global hotel industry had revenues of $432.6 billion, 1,000 times more than Airbnb. Businesses, especially young or small businesses, have to focus on the mental and moral dimensions to stand a chance at unseating incumbents, or for incumbents to maintain their position in the pecking order. The fourth thing I want to talk about is tempo and fast transients, that is, getting inside your adversary's OODA loop. When people talk about OODA loops, one of the common refrains is getting inside of your adversary's loop. While Boyd used the term adversary because he was dealing with military, you could think of it more as like competitors or the environment just generally. Getting inside your adversary's OODA loop creates a tangle of threatening events and generates mismatches between what an adversary expects you to do and what you actually do. This makes your adversary feel trapped in an unpredictable world of doubt, mistrust, confusion, disorder, fear, panic, and chaos. Your adversary is stretched beyond his moral, mental, physical capacity to adapt or endure, and can neither divine your intentions nor focus his efforts to cope, and ends up collapsing. Getting inside your adversary's loop creates moral and mental distress. The word, quote unquote, getting inside your adversary's OODA loop is sometimes interpreted as just moving fast or moving frenetically, going through the OODA loop process faster than your adversary. This creates this notion that you always need to be moving 100 miles an hour. What Boyd was implying was not a frenetic movement, but varying your tempo. Boyd called this variation in tempo a fast transient. The transient in dogfighting, when you're fighting airplanes, is the change between maneuvers. The ideal fast transient is an abrupt, unexpected, disorienting change that causes the other side to say, "What the fuck? What just happened?" Boyd was a renowned dogfighter because he would create these disorienting WTF moments by engaging in an unexpected maneuver before the other pilot was able to reorient. When you're inside your adversary's OODA loop, you have the momentum. A team can be losing a game, or a business can be second in its market, but have more momentum than its competitor. Even if they are losing on the scoreboard, the physical dimension, they are likely to win because they've gotten inside their adversary's OODA loop and are winning the moral and mental dimensions. Finally, uncertainty and opportunity are linked. Boyd's work looked at how any individual or organization could thrive in an uncertain world. He saw that one way people react to uncertainty is to try to eliminate it. They try to close themselves off from uncertainty. This is very common, and it almost always makes things worse in the long run. Individuals, organizations, cities, and nation-states thrive as parts of open systems. If they close themselves off, they suffocate. In our individual lives, we often do the same thing. The person who takes a seemingly secure, stable role because they are trying to avoid change can put themselves at a disadvantage in the long run. All their eggs are in one basket, and a potentially fragile basket at that. If that job disappears 20 years from now, they've not built a professional network or a skill set that would let them survive the setback. The freelancer that pursues a seemingly more risky path with more uncertainty also creates more opportunity. Working with many clients across different industries on different types of projects leads to more possibilities in the long run. A product team that works on a project for 2 years without getting user feedback reduces uncertainty in the short term. After all, user feedback risks ruining the perfectly laid out product roadmap they've designed. They also make it more likely that they will spend 2 years working on something that nobody actually wants to use or buy. The product team that opens itself up to feedback early in the process creates more uncertainty. Will people like it? Why or why not? Will they use it like we planned or in some other way? In doing so, they mitigate the risk of building something nobody wants, and they also create new possibilities. Perhaps users or customers will use the product in ways they didn't even imagine possible. Openness creates uncertainty, and with it opportunity. You cannot get one without the other. The people I know who have the most opportunities in their lives are the ones who are the best at living with large amounts of uncertainty. Think about the people you know and ask yourself, is this true as well? So the question then becomes, how do you open yourself up? In essence, you interact by staying open to people and sources of information coming from diverse points of view and by living in a way that is in alignment with your stated values. This sounds great, but is uncommon. There's a strong tendency built into our biology for people to close themselves off from different points of view and isolate themselves. Ask yourself, how many significant beliefs have you changed your mind about in the last year? Reality is constantly changing. If you aren't changing your beliefs about it, then you're falling out of sync. So given our deeper understanding of the OODA loop from the previous module, let's take a look back at the full diagram as sketched out by Boyd. The observation stage involves a broad range of inputs: the unfolding circumstances, the outside information, your interaction with the environment, and feedback from all three other stages. The orientation phase is the focus of the diagram and is larger than the other three steps combined. This is intentional. It's the most important one in Boyd's view. It involves analyzing, breaking down your cultural traditions, genetic heritage, new information, and previous experiences, and then synthesizing, putting together the elements into a new orientation. So there's three core attributes I want to look at. So far, we've looked at in detail at the mechanics of the OODA loop, how you actually go through it. But just as important is the way you or your team or organization approaches it. What are the attributes of an individual or team that can successfully use the OODA loop? Boyd studied the German Blitzkrieg in detail and found there were a few key attributes of the Blitzkrieg that were needed in order to be successful with using the OODA loop. The advantage of these attributes is they let you control the tempo and get inside your adversary's OODA loop more effectively, as we discussed in the previous module. The first is Einheit, and I apologize, my German pronunciation will not be perfect. Einheit means, roughly translated, mutual trust. If there's a universally accepted truth in military victory, it is probably the fundamental importance of mutual trust among a team. The German Blitzkrieg commander, Heinz Gadke, explained that one of the essential reasons for the success of the Blitzkrieg was that the German commanders all trusted each other implicitly. They had a relationship where they could look at each other in the eye and know exactly what needed to be done without speaking. True Einheit is the result of two things. The first is shared values. The German commanders all had a similar belief in the importance of fighting for their home country. Their time together in the military had created a common culture for them. The other thing is overcoming challenges together. The German commanders had all worked together, oftentimes since they were 18 years old. They didn't have to hope that their fellow commanders would do their jobs. They had seen them do it hundreds of times in the past and trusted them implicitly. So to create mutual trust, you must assemble your team based on shared core values, and you must confront and overcome complex and difficult situations together. Over time, this leads to real mutual trust and Einheit. When you are working with people you trust, you can each move through your OODA loop cycles much more quickly. When I ask someone who I trust implicitly because we have similar values and they have a multi-year track record of getting things done to execute on something, I don't have to micromanage them. I know they will get things done. I have trust. We have trust. I don't need to go in and check on them every time they do their orientation because I know they can do it. The most successful co-founder relationships and business partnerships, whether that's within an organization or outside of one, typically start years before the company in informal ways. They were working together in the same division of a larger company or a different company. They played basketball on the weekends or went to college together, or they had some club they were a part of. In all these cases, they were able to build up mutual trust. Creating mutual trust takes time. It's not something that you can do in a weekend retreat, but only over a period of years of working together. In the business world, the increase in freelancing has made this easier. It's easier to put together a small project and work with someone to see how you work together and begin to establish Einheit. If it goes well, you can continue working together and building up mutual trust that will make you more effective. For managers, the most important insight from Einheit is that you can't micromanage. You have to let people take ownership, even if they're going to make mistakes. In the long run, the mutual trust is more important than the small mistakes. The second core attribute I want to look at is Fingerspitzgefühl. Fingerspitzgefühl translates literally as fingertip feeling, but is probably more easily understood as intuitive skill or intuitive knowledge. The value of Fingerspitzgefühl in terms of OODA is that it collapses the Orient and decide stages down to nothing so that you can go through the loop faster and more easily get inside your adversary's OODA loop. You can go straight from observation to action to observation to action to observation to action. This allows you to increase the tempo much faster than someone who has to constantly reorient. While Boyd saw the orientation phase of the OODA loop as the most important, he recognized that people who achieved mastery in a specific domain could skip it because they had achieved a level of intuitive skill that allowed them to do so. When Roger Federer, or some famous tennis player, is getting ready to return a tennis serve, he doesn't consciously think, take your racket back, cock your wrist, keep your eye on the ball, plant your feet, follow through over your shoulder. He has been playing tennis, or she has been playing tennis, for so long that he or she intuitively knows what to do on the tennis court. In the same way, a good product manager can feel the right direction to take the product, and a good basketball player can often feel the right move to make to get past his defender. It's not something that's being done consciously. It's something that's being done as a sort of intuitive skill. One of the most common pieces of advice given to founders looking to start companies is to quote-unquote, scratch your own itch. This means building a product that you yourself actually use. This is an enormous advantage because if you use the product in your day-to-day life, you will develop an intuitive feel for it. While competitors are forced to run surveys or put together customer feedback groups and hold meeting after meeting to try and orient themselves, you'll have a much better intuitive feel for what the right decision is, allowing you to move more quickly and get inside your adversary's OODA loop. When you're competing against a larger competitor, intuitively knowing what to do is an essential advantage. Combined with Einheit, it means that your team has an intuitive feel for the right decisions and you trust each other to execute plans based on those decisions. This lets you keep up the tempo and pressure on even much larger competitors. The third attribute I want to look at is Schwerpunkt. Schwerpunkt literally translates as center of gravity or emphasis, but is best understood as focus or the main priority. In military terms, it is usually the geographic point of attack. Having a clear focus and emphasizing that over any particular tactic empowers your subordinates to make decisions for themselves in an uncertain environment. Imagine a military unit is ordered to take a hill, and the initial orders are to storm it from the south, because reconnaissance reports had said that the southern side was the most lightly defended. Once they arrive, the unit commander might see that the defense has moved, and now the south is actually the most heavily defended side, but the west is mostly wide open. If he knows that all that matters is taking the hill, that is, he understands the Schwerpunkt of their mission, he can be flexible in his approach and come in from the west side rather than the south. The opposite approach, giving everyone specific checklists with no flexibility, can lead to disaster. Compare how you feel about Zappos customer service. Zappos is an online shoe brand where employees are allowed to use their judgment to get the best outcomes for their customers. The counterexample might be United Airlines, which forces everyone to follow rigid guidelines with no flexibility. The experience there as a customer is very different. A good Schwerpunkt helps you and your team make better decisions in an uncertain environment, where rigid procedures do the opposite. They close you off and isolate you. If the Schwerpunkt for a marketing team is to increase leads by 50% in 90 days, the team can take many different approaches to achieving that goal. Instead of giving others plans, you give them objectives. That is a Schwerpunkt, and let them figure out how to get there. This both gives them a greater sense of ownership and empowers them to be flexible with trying different approaches. The combination of mutual trust, Einheit, intuitive skill, Fingerspitzgefühl, and focus, Schwerpunkt, lead to an enormous advantage. They are each able to identify new opportunities, Fingerspitzengefühl, leading to an agreed outcome, the Schwerpunkt, and trust each other to get the job done. This lets teams more easily get inside their adversary's OODA loop and win. If you combine these three core attributes with creation and destruction as described in the previous module, you'll be even more effective. By being able to orient well using creation and destruction principles, you will buffer your ability to implement the OODA loop by making up in situations where you haven't fully developed Fingerspitz Gefühl.